This presentation will review Math CBM administration, scoring, and how to interpret scores. So for math assessment, it's important at the start to find out the sequence of computational skills from the curriculum. Whereas when we talk about reading, the order of the skills and how they're taught is pretty standard. For math, this can vary from one curriculum to another as far as if multiplication and division are presented together, multiplication first followed by division, and you want to have a sense of that before you go into your assessment. And there are two types of CBM probes to use: single skill probes and multiple skill probes. So single skill probes are useful for providing specific recommendations about strengths and weaknesses, basically skills the student has or doesn't have. So if your single skill probe just assesses 2-digit by 2-digit addition, then you'll know if the student has that skill or not. They are typically used in the assessment of instructional placement, so you're able to see like they've mastered these skills, but here's where they started to fall off, and this is the skill that needs to be targeted. And so it's valuable for monitoring the acquisition of newly taught skills. So now here is the skill that's being targeted with instruction, and that is what we're monitoring here. Multiple skills probes assess a broader range of skills at the same time, and these are going to be good for progress monitoring. So you get that long-term measure, and good for determining when additional assessment may be necessary. So again, the multiple skills, if you imagine either across a year or across multiple years, your probe includes addition, subtraction, multiplication, division, and we monitor that, then we'll see growth across several years with those skills. And if the student kind of falls off track, then we know that we need to do further assessment, which would be more closely linked to what's actually happening in the curriculum. So when administering single skill probes, you need to figure out what skill, and this can be done through a teacher interview to get a sense of what is the instructional level of students, what's being targeted now, what's frustrational, that's too difficult, and what the student may have mastered already. You'd also could look at the curriculum, or you could administer a multiple skills probe first, and then when scoring it, look back and see the pattern of errors. You create several sheets of problems of the same type, leaving room for computation, and you provide a good sampling of all the numbers, and be careful about using 0. And you can create single skill probes on Intervention Central, where you enter the types of problems you want to have and how many you want in each sheet, and it generates the problem sheet as well as a answer key. Easy CBM also has math probes, and AIMSweb as well has math CBM assessment probes that are already created. So that saves some of the effort of sitting down and creating all those problems yourself. For multiple skill probes, when we're talking about finding out about instructional placement, you have to kind of come up with that upper limit skill and then a lower limit as far as how much you want to include. So if we're trying to figure out if the student's at second grade level, third grade level, we could look at that curriculum and see what's kind of the beginning skills, end skills, and take a sampling throughout. And then we also want to create a concepts application probe. So again, those are going to include more of your word problems, graphing, geometry type things that aren't your basic computation. For progress monitoring, we're going to have probes reflecting all the curricular objectives for that grade. And again, it's going to be a brief assessment because it's CBM, but it's going to have a sampling of those problems throughout, and we should see gains as they go through the year. A math CBM assessment takes between 2 to 5 minutes depending on the complexity of the problems. If you're talking about basic 1-digit by 1-digit multiplication, maybe that's 2 minutes, but when we get into 3-digit or 2-digit by 2-digit skills, then we're going to have a longer amount of time. We'll also have longer assessment times for the concepts applications probes, which involve students reading through word problems as well. So that will be more in the 5-minute range. And your scores are going to be reported as digits correct per minute. So we don't just report the number of problems correct, but we actually give credit for individual digits that are correct in the answers, and that's how we report the scores. When scoring Math CBM for addition and subtraction, you just count the digits correct below the answer line. For multiplication, there are a couple different ways. We look at digits correct below the answer line, including critical steps. So there are two ways to score this when we're talking about double-digit multiplication. We can compare the answer and the work, so all the numbers below the answer line, to a model, and we just simply compare, and all matching digits in the correct place are correct. Or we can pay attention to different skills. So in two-digit by two-digit multiplication, we have multiplication and addition, and we can give credit for correct addition even if multiplication errors are made, and vice versa. So if the student multiplied incorrectly but then they added correctly to get to their final answer, we can give digits correct for that correct addition. Or we can just score the final answer. Traditional math CBM scored by paying attention to the critical steps and for accounting for multiplication and division. But what's happened, we've seen with changes in how students are taught. For example, some students aren't being taught the typical algorithm for double-digit multiplication, and instead are being taught, say, a lattice approach. So then we can't do the traditional scoring. It doesn't match up with how they're showing their work. So we may opt to just score the final answer. So really the final answer, to count the digits correct there. Similarly, for division, we can score the digits correct, including the answer and the critical steps in the remainder. And there are two ways to score this. We can compare the answer and the work to the model, where all matching digits in correct place are correct, or we can pay attention to the different skills. Again, we need multiplication, addition, subtraction all go into long division, and we can give credit for correct operations independently. Or we can just score the final answer. So really that, three-digit, two-digit response, and record digits correct there. In scoring, reversed or rotated digits are not incorrect. They're not recorded as errors unless you can no longer identify the number. You give credit for placeholders, whether or not they actually use a zero. There's no credit for any work above the answer line, so if there's carrying or borrowing, you can ignore any marks like that. If the student doesn't show their work but the answer is correct and you're scoring according to paying attention to critical steps or comparing to the model, then you would give credit for all those potential digits, assuming that the work would have all been correct. If no work is shown and the answer is incorrect, you can only score what you see. Our score will be digits correct per minute, and that's the digits correct times 60 seconds over the seconds allowed for the student to complete the probe. To score inter-scorer agreements, so if I score a probe and you score one, we look at agreements times 100 over agreements plus disagreements. When interpreting the results of Math CBM, we can compare the student's performance to local or national normative data, and there are national norms available from AIMSweb. You could also look at historical criteria for what may be frustrational, instructional, or mastery levels, and those guidelines are provided in your Shapiro text. And it's important just that whenever you're making a comparison to another group, that you account for the way the probes were scored in administration. So if I scored just looking at the final answer and my norms scored by paying attention to all of the work below the answer line, those critical steps, then that wouldn't be a fair comparison. So that you need to pay attention to that when picking a comparison group or comparison scores. There are also some early math CBM measures, and I just want to review those quickly. But oral counting, you just have the students start at 1 and count as high as they can. For number identification, the student's given a probe sheet of numbers, and they're just asked to identify the numbers. Quantity discrimination, the student's presented with a pair of numbers and asked to identify the larger value. And for missing number, they are given sequences of 3 to 4 numbers, and they're asked to fill in the one missing number in the sequence. And like our early literacy measures, these are helpful for identifying students, in preschool and kindergarten who may be at risk and need early math support.